Pastor Mark ran towards his car, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his keys. He had to escape before the police got to him. But just as he opened the car door, he heard a loud voice behind him. "Stop right there!" He turned around and saw two police officers running toward him. His heart pounded in his chest. He had been caught. Before we continue this thrilling story, we want to hear from you. Tell us what part of the world you are watching this video from in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss any of our exciting stories. Hit the like button and share with your friends. Now sit back and enjoy the story. Pastor Mark jumped into his car and tried to start the engine. But before he could drive away, the officers reached him. One of them grabbed the door and pulled it open. "You are under arrest for child endangerment and inappropriate behavior," the officer said firmly. "This is a mistake," Pastor Mark shouted. "I am a man of God. This is all a lie." But the officer didn't listen. He pulled out his handcuffs and locked them around Pastor Mark's wrists. Inside the church, Lily, her parents, and the church members ran outside to see what was happening. Lily watched as the police put Pastor Mark onto the police car. A mix of emotions swirled inside her. Fear, relief, and sadness. "He's really gone," she whispered. Mrs. Johnson hugged her. "Yes, sweetheart, you are safe now." But Lily wasn't so sure. News about Pastor Mark spread through the town quickly. Some people were shocked. Others refused to believe it. "This can't be true," an old woman in the market said. "Pastor Mark is a good man." But the Johnsons had proof. Another person whispered. "And what about the other girl who spoke up?" Some people believed Lily's story, while others defended Pastor Mark, saying it was all a misunderstanding. Meanwhile, at home, Lily still felt nervous. "What if people get mad at me for telling the truth?" she asked her mother. Mrs. Johnson smiled gently. "Sometimes people don't want to believe the truth because it scares them. But you were brave, Lily. You did the right thing." Lily nodded, but deep inside, she still felt uneasy. A few days later, something strange happened. Mr. Johnson went outside to check the mailbox. As he pulled out the letters, he saw a small envelope with no name. Frowning, he opened it. Inside was a piece of paper with a short message. "You have made a big mistake. This is not over." Mr. Johnson's hands tightened around the paper. His face turned dark. "What is it?" Mrs. Johnson asked, walking over. He showed her the note. She gasped. "Who sent this?" she whispered. "I don't know," Mr. Johnson said, looking around, "but someone is trying to scare us." Lily, who had been watching from the window, felt a chill run down her spine. Was Pastor Mark really gone, or was someone still trying to protect him? The next Sunday, the Johnson family went back to church. A new pastor was supposed to come and replace Pastor Mark, but when they arrived, something felt different. People whispered as they walked past. Some gave them strange looks. Others completely ignored them. Mrs. Johnson held Lily's hand tightly. "Stay close to me," she whispered. As they took their seats, an old man stood up and spoke loudly. "I don't think the Johnsons should be here," he said. Gasps filled the room. Lily's heart pounded. "Why is he saying that?" she whispered to her mother. The man continued. "Pastor Mark was a good man. They ruined his name. What if they are lying?" Some people murmured in agreement. Others shook their heads. Mr. Johnson stood up. "Are you saying my daughter is lying?" he asked, his voice firm. "I'm saying we don't know the full story," the man argued. "Pastor Mark helped this church for years. We need more proof before we believe such things about him." Mrs. Johnson's eyes burned with anger. "We already gave proof. And another girl also spoke up. How much more do you need? The church fell into an uneasy silence. Lily looked around. Some people looked guilty, others looked angry. It was clear some still didn't believe her. And worse, someone had sent that threatening letter. That night, Lily couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the letter and the church members who still supported Pastor Mark. She turned over in bed and stared at the ceiling. What if someone was trying to help Pastor Mark? What if he wasn't working alone? A sudden noise outside made her sit up in fear. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like someone was at her window. Lily's heart raced. She pulled her blanket over her head. The tapping stopped. Then, a whisper. Lily, I know what you did. Lily's breath caught in her throat. Her hand shook as she reached for the lamp and switched it on. She ran to her parents' room. Mom, Dad, she cried. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson jumped out of bed. What is it, baby? Mrs. Johnson asked. There was someone outside my window, Lily stammered. Mr. Johnson grabbed a flashlight and rushed outside. He shined the light around the house. Nothing. No footprints. No sign of anyone. But just as he was about to go back inside, he saw something on the ground. A small piece of paper. He picked it up and unfolded it. His hands trembled as he read the words. You can't hide the truth. Some secrets should stay buried. Mr. Johnson stared at the piece of paper in his hand. The message was clear. You can't hide the truth. Some secrets should stay buried. His eyes darted around the dark yard. The wind rustled the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. Mrs. Johnson came outside, holding Lily close. What is it? She asked. Wordlessly, Mr. Johnson handed her the note. She read it and gasped. Who could have left this? Lily clutched her mother's hand. Mom, I heard someone whispering my name right outside my window. Mrs. Johnson tightened her grip on Lily. This is not over, she whispered. Mr. Johnson exhaled deeply and looked around once more before locking the front gate. We're calling the police first thing in the morning. The next morning, the Johnson family sat at the police station, waiting to meet the officer in charge of Pastor Mark's case. When the officer arrived, he took the note from Mr. Johnson and frowned as he read it. This is serious, he said. It seems someone doesn't want you talking about Pastor Mark. Mrs. Johnson shook her head. We are not going to be silenced. The officer nodded. We'll increase patrols around your home and see if we can find out who left the note. As they left the station, Lily felt a little safer, knowing the police were involved. But deep down, she still felt uneasy. That evening, as they were about to eat dinner, there was a knock at the door. Mr. Johnson stood up cautiously and opened it. His eyes narrowed. Standing there was Deacon Paul, one of the senior members of the church. Good evening, Brother Johnson, Deacon Paul said in a calm voice. May I come in? Mr. Johnson hesitated. Then, stepping aside, he let him in. Deacon Paul sat down and sighed. I heard about what happened in church last Sunday. You've caused a lot of trouble, you know. Mrs. Johnson folded her arms. Trouble? You mean we told the truth? Deacon Paul leaned forward. Look, I'm not saying Pastor Mark was innocent, but this situation has divided the church. Some people believe you, others think you've ruined a good man's name. Mr. Johnson's face darkened. And what do you think, Deacon Paul? The deacon shrugged. I think sometimes it's best to let things go. Pastor Mark is already in police custody. There's no need to keep stirring the waters. Lily could feel her mother's anger rising. Mrs. Johnson stood up. Let things go. Someone came to our house last night and left a threatening note outside my daughter's window. And you're telling us to stay quiet? Deacon Paul's expression didn't change. I'm only saying you should be careful. Not everyone is happy about what you did. He stood up. dusted off his coat, and gave them a small smile. "Be safe," he said, before walking out the door. Mr. Johnson shut the door behind him. Lily hugged her mother. "Mom, I don't like him." Mrs. Johnson rubbed Lily's back. "Neither do I, baby." Mr. Johnson clenched his jaw. "He wasn't here to help us. He was here to warn us." The next day, Lily was playing in the backyard when she heard voices over the fence. It was their neighbor, Mrs. Taylor, talking to someone on the phone. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but when she heard Pastor Mark's name, she froze. "Yes, I heard they arrested him," Mrs. Taylor whispered. "But let me tell you a secret. Pastor Mark is not the only one involved in this mess." Lily's heart skipped a beat. Who else was involved? She tiptoed closer, trying to hear more. "But they will never admit it," Mrs. Taylor continued. "Too much money was moving through that church. If people find out the truth, the whole place will collapse." Lily's hands trembled. She had to tell her parents. She ran back into the house. "Mom! Dad!" she shouted. Her parents rushed to her. "What is it, sweetheart?" Mrs. Johnson asked. Lily took a deep breath. "Pastor Mark wasn't working alone. There's a bigger secret inside the church." Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Johnson exchanged a worried look. "What kind of secret?" Mr. Johnson asked. "I don't know," Lily admitted, "but I think we need to find out." That night, Mr. Johnson made a decision. "I'm going back to the church," he said. "If something is being hidden, we need to find proof." Mrs. Johnson hesitated. "Are you sure that's safe?" "I'll be careful," he promised. A few hours later, when the streets were quiet, Mr. Johnson snuck into the church. The doors were locked, but he knew where Pastor Mark used to keep a spare key. Once inside, he moved quietly toward the pastor's office. He opened drawers, looking for anything suspicious. Then, in a locked cabinet, he found a folder labeled "Confidential." He opened it, and his eyes widened in shock. Inside were bank statements, secret donations, and names of church leaders involved in shady deals. Mr. Johnson grabbed his phone and started taking pictures of everything. But just as he snapped the last photo, a voice spoke behind him. "I knew you'd come looking." Mr. Johnson's heart stopped. He turned around slowly and saw Deacon Paul standing in the doorway. Mr. Johnson's hands tightened around his phone as he stared at Deacon Paul standing in the doorway. The deacon's face was calm, but his eyes were dark and serious. "I knew someone would come snooping around," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Mr. Johnson didn't move. His heart pounded in his chest. "What are you hiding, Paul?" he asked, his voice firm. Deacon Paul chuckled and leaned against the desk. "You're a smart man, Brother Johnson, but smart men often find themselves in trouble." Mr. Johnson clenched his fist. "So, it's true. This isn't just about Pastor Mark, is it?" "There's more." The deacon sighed. "Let me ask you something. What do you think keeps a church running?" Mr. Johnson frowned. "Faith, honesty." The people Deacon Paul shook his head. "Number money. Without it, there's no church, no programs, no power." Mr. Johnson's stomach turned. "So, you are using the church to steal?" The deacon smirked. "Steal? No, my friend. We were simply making sure the money flowed into the right hands." "And Pastor Mark?" Mr. Johnson pressed. "Was he part of it?" Deacon Paul's smile faded. "He was a problem. He got careless. And now, because of your little hero act, he's in jail." Mr. Johnson glared at him. "You're trying to cover up your mess." Deacon Paul stepped closer. "I'm trying to protect the church. If people find out what's in those files, everything will fall apart. People will lose faith. Lives will be ruined." Mr. Johnson held up his phone. "I already took pictures. The truth is coming out whether you like it or not." Deacon Paul's eyes darkened. Then, without warning, he lunged. Mr. Johnson barely had time to react before Deacon Paul grabbed his wrist, trying to snatch the phone. "Give me that!" Paul growled, his grip tight. Mr. Johnson struggled, pushing the deacon back. "You're not getting away with this!" They stumbled against the desk. Papers and books flew to the floor. Mr. Johnson twisted his arm, trying to break free. Suddenly, the door swung open. "Stop!" Both men froze. Standing there was Mrs. Johnson with a police officer right behind her. The officer stepped in, his hand on his gun. "What's going on here?" Deacon Paul quickly let go of Mr. Johnson and forced a smile. "Oh, officer, this is just a misunderstanding." Mrs. Johnson crossed her arms. "No, it's not. My husband found something. I flew." And this man tried to stop him. Mr. Johnson caught his breath and held up his phone. "I have proof, financial records, evidence that people in the church have been stealing." The officer frowned. "Hand it over." Mr. Johnson quickly sent the pictures to the officer's phone before passing it to him. Deacon Paul's face turned pale. "You don't understand. If this gets out, the whole church deserves to know the truth." The officer interrupted. "And you, sir, need to come with me." Deacon Paul's shoulders slumped. He knew there was no escape. As the officer led him away, he turned back to Mr. Johnson and whispered, "You think this is over? There are others, and they won't stop." That night, back at home, Lily sat on the couch, listening to her parents talk. "So many people were involved," Mrs. Johnson said. "How deep does this go?" Mr. Johnson sighed. "I don't know, but if Paul was willing to fight me over those files, it means there's someone more powerful behind all of this." Lily looked at them nervously. "Does this mean we're still in danger?" Her father nodded slowly. "Maybe, but we won't be afraid." Just then, a loud knock came at the door. Everyone froze. Mr. Johnson grabbed the baseball bat. Mrs. Johnson motioned for Lily to stay behind. He walked slowly to the door, took a deep breath, and opened it. A hooded figure stood there. In their hand was an envelope. They held it out, then turned and disappeared into the night. Mr. Johnson picked up the envelope, his fingers trembling. He tore it open and read the note inside. It said, "You may have stopped one of us, but we are everywhere."